Summer 910. It had been some time before, many years before, when Osric had told the Lord Ethelred about St. Oswald's body. Her ancestor from many generations, he was revered in life as a godly man, who brought Irish Christianity to Bernicia, never mind that his uncle, Edwin, had brought Augustinian Christianity to Northumbria before him, and more so in death, when the last pagan king, the Mercian, Offa, killed and had dismembered Oswald's body. But the king's relics had begun to cause healing, and even in the direst of cases his body, his arm, his hand, had caused kings and men to seek him out. So, in the reign of Ethelred of Mercia, his wife, Osric, had commissioned that her grandfather's body be entombed at Bardney Abbey, in Lindsey, Lincolnshire, where it had carried on producing miracles. It had been a long time ago when Osric had told Ethelred that story, and how it was dear to all who had lived in Northumbria. He had listened, and had allowed Oswald's cult to build over the years, and then responded to petitions that the blessed saint could not be left in Bardney any longer, for he would be despoiled, as had so many Christian sites and saintly burials been, by the Danes. So now, here she was, Osric, with a procession of warriors and priests and, of course, Ethelred's man, Aldhelm, with the man's corpse leading the way back to Aylesbury. That he had never been associated with Aylesbury before was irrelevant. St. Oswald, or most of his relics, at any rate, were destined to be interred at Gloucester, a place where Ethelfled was re-establishing, and it was a show of unity that the saint should be re-interred there. It was mere detail that Bibbenberg still had Oswald's head, the most important body part when it came to relics, especially relics from saints not long after the conversion of pagans to Christianity in Northumbria. 2 priests had been charged to ride north and retrieve them. And no talk was given that they really should be into Tenhulg, to meet with Ethelfled and, possibly, King Edward, to face the growing Norse and Danish threat in the northwest of Mercia. All of that was detailed to Osric. She could no more influence Ethelred than she could anyone else, despite what Ethelfled thought. Instead, she let her mind drift to her companions, Miral, who was riding just before the carriage of St. Oswald, and Ossier, who was commanding his own division now. How her boys had grown now, Osric thought, with the delight that might only be matched by a mother. Ossier, a commander, and Eglofrith were now men. Leofstan had been killed out on a skirmish at the Danish border, but Falkberg was still alive, and worked for Ethelred in the hall at Aylesbury. But Osric's mind wowed not still to thoughts of her immediate concern. She was still irked by Ethelfled, and her manner with her at her encampment just north of Saltwick. Clearly, she had found out about her relationship to Uhtred, and it had never entered her head not to tell Sciora, or her own daughter, or her nephew, narcissistic bitch that she was. By now, though, the Lady of the Mercians must know that her only daughter was the only person to secure an independent Mercia, and Osric had to give her credit for the sleight she had played, over a long period of time, convince Mercia they were indeed an independent kingdom, and fight and live as such while at the same time overarchingly behave that Mercia and Wessex were one. Teach Elfwin, Osric Thougjugt, teach your daughter to fight, so she may defend Mercia. And so Ethelfled had, or at least, tried to. And she remembered a conversation with Ethelfled, before she left to recover St. Oswald, where Osric thought they might be getting on in reasonable terms, and she spoke about Ethelred, and fatherhood. Fatherhood? Ethelfled had scoffed. Fathers don't want what's best for their children, they just want peace and quiet, being respected and status, and a chance to manipulate by approval and disapproval and need a woman to complete themselves. Both women knew Ethelfled was speaking about Edith, the woman who shared Ethelred's bed, of a household riddled with debt where she, and her brother, had to find means to repay it. And I am unacceptable because I don't want a man on their terms, designed for men's sexual aims, everything based on sex, eroticization of women, everything to do with what a woman is, what she can be used for. Ethelfled had continued, shaking her head. Men have set society up to give men a purpose of usefulness, to fill a void, and they don't have a meaningful life otherwise. She then took up her sword, as if the Lady of the Mercians' words were the most profound things ever to have been uttered, and that before she had said them, no one had ever thought those things. Osrith had felt like wringing her neck at her arrogance. She had known these things at 11. What had Ethelfled known? To make herself feel better, spoil her brother's food, or hide his possessions? Ethelfled went on to explain her choice of chastity, of which Osrith knew was a lie, and continued, the female can condition away her sex drive to leave her free to do what she wants. Chastity is a path to freedom. Men lures, and women condition to need to keep having sex with him. And she had continued, lecturing Osrith, as if her words would convince her that, as long as they came from Alfred's daughter, on the path to sainthood herself, that her women had been cursed by God from the time of the Eden. Women's sexual desire is a punishment for Eve's temptation. And so you see, Osrith, she had concluded, when men hate something they want to intrude and violate it themselves, and can't understand why women would want to isolate themselves from a man, it is inconceivable to them. Can you not feel, when you have been chaste for some time, that you can access higher things? Men cannot help themselves in terms of women, I know this. Osrith had listened, and eventually, Ethelfled had finished with a flourish, declaring her wish to pray. Instead of joining her, which Osrith knew to be a slight, she went to the stables to collect her things. Ethelfled had not known Ethelred had chosen her to ride into East Anglia with his men. Nor did she know that she was wrong. She had violated her own oath to never be with Finan again. And now? Buckfastleigh, Aldhelm called, pointing to a raised ridge, with a settlement over it, as Osrith moved her hand over her stomach for a moment. Not far to Aylesbury now, Osrith, he grinned. If anyone knew how important this mission was to her, it was Aldhelm. And, he added, inclining his head towards her, please do not let the Lord Ethelred know I told you. He had agreed for you to accompany your saint onwards, to Gloucester, for his reinterment. Osrith smiled, happily, and Aldhelm nodded, to show that he knew she understood. Two things that Ethelfled could not interfere with, and a third, perhaps, if she thought she could control her husband's troop movements. He would be there at Titenholg. Osrith knew it. It was Mercian territory after all. Just not at the beck and call of his wife. Osrith's mind drifted further back, to the time she had left Dunnottar, before she had gone to Caligwilid, to Bibbenberg, south to Saltwick, and then, southeast to Aylesbury. There had been a time that she had so desperately wanted to be back with Domhnall and be in his service again. However, as Constantine had pointed out before she left Alba, the use he had been trying to put her to did not include any of her martial skills whatsoever. It was your marital skills he was interested in, Constantine had told her, laughing at the poor joke. Osrith did not laugh. But the alliance through her marriage to Guthred was now useful to the King of Alba, for this gave him a hold over his weak cousin Dyfnwald, nominal King of Strathclyde, and access to the land he claimed in Bernicia, to the wall via Cumbraland. It is a kind of symmetry. Your brother married his sister, her brother married to you. I will never marry. Osrith stormed. But Constantine was smiling one of his smiles, which was meant to reassure who he was talking to but meanwhile show he had the upper HND. Those papers Abbot Eardred holds, Constantine mused. But Osrith had interrupted, I did not consent. Not even for the safety of Edra? Constantine proposed, his mouth still smiling. But Osrith knew better, and knew his weakness over the child. She is nearly 10, she may come with me. She was right, and delighted to be so, for Constantine had stopped smiling, and now looked concerned. You would take her? From here? I could. Osrith threatened. She had folded her arms. Oh, do not fear for the money, I would never ask for silver to be paid. And that was her consent. Osrith had told Constantine she would indeed go to Guthred and negotiate an agreement, on the basis of a marriage she hadn't even realized was going happening, when she was 14. It was only then that Constantine had looked satisfied. He had beckoned her over. He would be quietly killed before he even touched you, Osrith, he has assured her. In fact, you could for it yourself. Me? A king killer? Osrith had shaken her head. He may be a Dane, but he is the anointed king of Cumbraland and accepted by my uncle, and my brother. Did he not enslave you to Dragnarsson? Constantine was good at asking questions he thought others would find difficult to answer. He made his peace with him. Osric added, "I will not marry him, Constantine, or accept him as my husband if you choose to argue that we are already married. You need to find another way." And there was another way. "You need to go south, far south, to Edward," Constantine had explained, hand on her arm. "My spies, of which you are one, tell me Heston and Canute bring an army against Mercia. Ethelred has gone east in search of your ancestor, Oswald." Oh, the irony. Osric had not replied, but let him say it anyway. The last pagan kingdom's present king seeks the Northumbrian king his ancestor slew as a pagan, whom Penda martyred near the border with the Cymric. His back is turned, Osric, Constantine pressed, when Osric had not replied. Become Ethelred's lover and find put all that is needed about the Danes. But Osric had folded her arms. "Throw me out then," she challenged the king, silently, "like you did when you were younger. I know you insulted Domnall because he challenged you to come up with an answer, and the answer included sending me away. If you wish me to find out all the Lord of Mercia knows," Osric replied, "be assured that I will do this my way." She took a step to Constantine. "Men only think of women as lovers and whores and skivvies to be lost in childbirth. Accept me, I will be none of those things." I knew my memory was true, Osric thought to herself, as the Mercian town where they were going to rest that night came closer. The horses pulling St. Oswald's carriage splashed through the shallow, wide ford, refreshing them as the Mercian guard rode in the heat of the summer. Ethelfled was not the first to decry men. How she hadn't murdered that bitch by now, Osric would never know. And she remembered her guilt as she thought back to that day, as Constantine's face became fixed again at her words. She had realized then what she had said only after stalking from the throne room. She hadn't meant it. Mary, Constantine's wife, had died giving birth to a daughter not 2 wheels before. Constantine had, despite the cold beginning to their marriage, loved her. Osric had loved her too, Mary of the Uyneel. She had loved the determined, haughty, imperious black-haired princess of who had been betrothed to Constantine at Teamreach at the Uyneel moot. Constantine had said nothing to her as he watched her leave the throne room. "I expect you will gain a great welcome from the Lord Ethelred, when we return to Aylesbury," Aldhelm told her, tapping her arm. "Well done, by the way." "Why?" Osric asked, hoping he wasn't going to say that he had informed their lord that it was Osric herself who had led the charge against the Danes who had put up, frankly, a half-hearted show, which hadn't really warranted 100 warriors. But then, they hadn't known that, and the prestige in recovering their beloved scent was worth it. "Because I have informed Lord Ethelred that you led the charge against the Danes." "Why?" thought Osric, dully, as her horse lessened her speed, and she clung on, trying not to fall off as her hooves met stony ground. She would only have to go through a ceremony where he praised her, and sit and be congratulated. She knew she had done well. And she knew she would have to report all she knew of the Saxons' battle strategies back to Constantine. Because that was the agreement. But she would have to go back soon, Osric knew, sooner than she wanted. The road was no place for two, no place to go through what Osric knew would be inevitable, in about 5 or 6 months' time. Although, if what she suspected was true, it would be nothing short of a miracle. 88,888,888. Ethelred met them out of Aylesbury, battle-clad, no time to discuss glories and honours. Aldhelm was charged to get Oswald to Gloucester, quickly, and join them at Tenhulk. Behind him, Eadith, his red-headed whore, was getting dressed as he directed Osric to Miral, and her heart soared. There was truly nothing more the Lord of Mercia could have done to reward her, if reward was due, for anything she had done at Bardney, and that he had just treated her like any other captain was a joy to her. "We do not know how we will form on the field," Miral had said. "You can take a section, to the middle. We will get there and the fighting will have already begun, so we will have to focus our forces." He looked at Osric. "This is acceptable to you?" "You have to ask," asked Osric. "Osric, I do not doubt your heart," Miral replied, touching her shoulder. nor your ability to carry out battle strategy, and adapt it to effect on the field. I have to ask, as I ask all my captains. It is acceptable to me, Osrith confirmed, and marched, with the rest of Ethliad's army, to the fields of Woden'sfield, and to war. 88,888,888. The battle was hard won. Many, many lives were lost that day, and had not Edward eventually fielded the West Saxons, and had not the standoffish Cymric entered the field, on promise of battle spoils, the Danes and Norse would have won the day. Osrith saw a flash of Wulfhead that told her that her brother had brought in his men, but she had made sure that she had not searched for Finan, or she might make a mistake in judgment. She was here for the Mersons, nothing more. And when the battle was tight and the Danes had pressed them hard, who would ever have thought that Aldhelm, a Merson through and through, would have bellowed, "Thank God for the blessed Welsh." Dialogue. DWI. Osrith shouted, as a Cymric warrior saved her from a blow from a Danish war axe. He nodded his head, as his scarlet cloak swung around his shoulders. Nac you, DDADWI. He replied, and she repaid the favor by running through an horseman, who had been trying to swing a sword into his neck. Osrith did not know how it was that she found herself facing the Dane Hestin. Ethelfled, too far out of her depth through inexperience on any battlefield, had got herself into difficulty, and she and Aldhelm, who had pitched in to help her, were trying to fend off 5 enemy. Osrith was not so far away that she couldn't get closer and, bringing 2 Mersons with her, set them, with herself, on a rear attack on the Danes who were attacking the lady. And the man ran. He actually bent his head and fled the onslaught, choosing instead to follow the Dane Osrith knew as Canute, heading up into a spinney of trees up on a hill. No time to yell, "Did you see that?" to her neighbor, but Osrith's mind was screaming it, as she plunged on. The 2 Mersons with her had managed to clear away 3 of the Danes, and Osrith shouted, "Guard her!" as a Northman struck to her right. Aldhelm should have managed him on his own, and he turned to do so, but he caught his ankle on his other foot, and tumbled to his knees. Osrith could not save him. As a model of devotion to his country, his cool collected self-giving instructions, and on the field, he was good, a good man. His acceptance of her for what she was, a warrior in the pay of Mercia. Osrith liked him. Which was why it was like a hand of ice closing around her heart when the Northman, triumphant, drew up his foot, driving Aldhelm's shield edge into his neck, partially decapitating him, as he drove a spear into his chest. But she could attack him. Bué had her day, and the Northman had no time to savor his victory before a sword ran him through, tagged 6 in the face for good measure. And then hands grabbed her, and she found that she had a hand around her throat. It was Hestin. "Do not struggle, Wakilt," he mocked, as Osrith's hands, both holding her weapons, as tightly as possible. But it was impossible to get an advantage to use either. "I have killed women," he growled, as he brought her round to show her Woden'sfield from the Northman's point of view, from the point of view of anyone who wanted to see Angle and Saxon, united for a common purpose, getting bloodily slaughtered before her eyes. "Does this not appall you? Does it not appall you?" Osrith replied, in Danish. Up to the spinney, she noticed, Brida was charging after her brother. And then Hestin crumpled at her feet. Osrith was surprised to see, and very pleased to see a face she knew. "Elfkin!" Osrith exclaimed, her once young warrior saving her life again. "Go, now!" she added, as the surge of Mersons to the western flank indicated the press Ethliad had ordered, and Osrith looked across, her heart thumping for sadness at Aldhelm's body. Ethelfled, because to her, it was all about her, was acting as if she were fighting the remaining Danes who had not taken after the Mersons, which meant that the 2 men guarding her were doing the actual fighting. She did actually kill one, Osrith thought, forcing charitable thoughts into her brain. But, there was no time to think, as a group of Cymric, who assumed the fight was over, were already picking through the bodies of the dead over on the eastern side. "Go with them!" she shouted, in Cymric. But neither moved again, as a Norseman, huge, with orange hair and beard, bore down on both of the men, and had hacked through their spinal columns with an axe held in each hand. Cold control flooded Osrith as she thought about the man before her. She knew him, Osrith's hindbrain realized, but he had lowered his axes, and instead tried to be making to dive past her. Easy, thought Osrith, as her blade swished into the air, but the Norseman did not counter her attack. Instead, he pulled her around, and to himself, holding her tight as Buey sliced into his leg. "You are the very woman I have been looking for," said Canute, Bryder's lover, Ragnar's cousin and murderer. "I have heard better pick-up lines," Osrith replied, in Norse, and he roared with laughter. "If I were going to kill you, you would be dead by now," Canute continued, wrestling her away from the fighting. "You have fought well today, killed many of my kinsmen. But then, suddenly, let her go." A group of Cymric were charging into the spinney. Osrith swiped at the man as he made a run for it, and managed a deep cut into his leather trousers, and Osrith staggered, off balance, and she noticed the noise of the battle ween. The Saxons, and Angles and Cymric, were gaining ground, and Osrith stumbled towards the melee, with only a vague idea that she had a big cut to her arm, and found herself on the edge of a group of nobles, Ethelfled and Edward at the center, surrounding a prone body. It was Aethliad. 88,888,888. Of course, she could not get close to the Lord of Mercia. All were there with Aethliad, Edward too, and Meeral stood in place for Aldhelm. This was his family, after all. She was not needed, and a ripple of sadness crept across her stomach. He looked awful, with the wide cut to the back of his skull. Aethliad was still breathing, but only just. Meeral stood by his side, as Aldhelm used to, and it was only then that Osrith realized that her friend, once off as brusque and cantankerous Scart, who had regained favor in Mercia and his family's name, titles and lands, had actually been promoted. "Leave, now, all of you." The order came from her brother, who was, predictably, accompanied by Finan. Osrith gave Uhtred a sly smile, not caring whether he saw her or not. The last thing she had heard, Wigga still held Bebbanburg, and that was yet another joy that Osrith knew. Ethelfled, supplicant wife, kneeling at her husband's bedside, head bowed in faux grief, could not get away from her. As Osrith made to leave, she caught Finan's eye. She had not intended to, and he bore his lips into a smile, just briefly. Outside the field tent, Osrith breathed deeply, before going to bathe her wound in boiled water. She would have to repair her shirt, there was no doubt about that. But, for several months at least, she wouldn't be wearing it at all. At least Elasade, Dunnottar's elderly house servant, was excellent with a needle. Osrith's sewing was worse than poor. In fact, garments were better when she hadn't begun on them at all. She was smiling at Elasade's dry words, still with her after nearly 30 years, when the Pictish woman had taken a piece of repair work from Osrith and said those words to her. Elasade must be in her 70s by now, Glimri too, though he cooked as well as she remembered him doing, when she had arrived at the fortress, shouldered in by Saenid, and fed before a roaring fire by the cook, always unfailingly generous to Osrith. "What has amused you?" Finan's voice was by her shoulder, and she turned to look at him. She told him. He looked down at her arm, and then back to her face. "You probably sew better than you ride a horse," he replied, and he was her Finan again, making her laugh with his cutting sarcasm. Then, her brother exited Aethliad's tent. Without looking at her, he turned and made his way over to Hyldda, who was regrouping his men. A good deal of battle loot was in wooden boxes beside his feet. "I will kill him, one day," Osrith said to the figure of her retreating brother. But got no chance to say any more, for Finan was kissing her. "Come," he said, taking her good hand and leading her from Aethliad's tent. "Look, he began, clearly something to say, but Ethelfled stepped from the tent. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Osrith. "Ethelfled," she acknowledged. "Osrith." She glanced at Finan. "So, the Mersons have still not murdered you?" Osrith turned, and faced the Lady of the Mersons head on. "You see, I chose my name. And I was not married to Aethliad first, and I did not murder the king of Mercia." "No, just the king of Alba," Ethelfled retorted. So, her reputation as some sort of witch had been conflated with Domhnall's death, then? But Osrith buried her rising anger, and sunk it to icy coolness in her stomach. Should you decide to visit Dunnottar, should you wish to show your face, not a begging let afraid, should the Strathclyde Cymric not murder you on the way, you will see King Constantine is in very good health. Ethelfled said nothing, for a moment, which was unusual for her. Normally, the Lady of the Mersons had something aptly cutting to say, especially for someone, like Osrith, whose reputation, knowledge or ability they wished to diminish. Lady, Finan nodded diplomatically. You see, my husband, Ethelfled began. The sympathy card, Osrith thought, scornfully, and on a day other than that day, she would let her carry on and ignore her. But instead, she interrupted before the lady could get started. For the record, I like Ethlied, Osrith told Ethelfled's shocked face. I am sorry he had to marry you when he could have been king in his own right. I pity Uhtred, I really do. I thought you hated him? Ethelfled stirred. So, she was back to accusations, now, when grief was getting her nowhere. Osrith pulled herself to her feet, nodded at Finan, and began to walk away. Away, to the Mercian army, as the thoughts of the three stakeholders in the fate of Lord Ethlied ran through her mind. If he were to die. If Ethlied were to die, Edward would want to subsume Mercia. For its own good, Osrith, he had told her, post-coshly, when she had gone to do Ethelfled's dirty work for her. The lords of Mercia, they would naturally assume to the independence of their kingdom, although no direct line of kings still remained. Ludica, for example, was married to a daughter of Ceolwulf, and had a position by marriage. Osrith looked back to Ethlied's tent again. Oh, she hoped she had trained her daughter well, Osrith thought. Elfwin. For she was the strongest by blood of any of them for Mercia, and also a girl barely old enough for marriage, and there were, as far as Osrith could tell, no suitable matches for the girl. But, he might live, yet. Ethlied. Osrith sank to the dry grass before a pair of war horses, who were placidly eating it, and held her arm. Osrith's injury had made her addled, which wasn't like her, and she quickly shuffled her uncomfortable bindings down her body and, spying a pot boiling over the fire that a tanner was using to soften leather, put the fabric in. Can you hold this? She asked of the tanner, who looked across from shaping the leather, at her exposed arm in her ripped sleeve, and put down the leather he was working on. The heat was good, although Osrith still felt a little dizzy, and she thanked the man as his hands, clean from the hot water, bound her wound. You could have said something to her, Lord, Finan added, as he and Uhtred ate soup prepared by the Wessex army. Well-worn wooden bowls held harvest's delights, plus spring lamb, and both men ate the broth carefully as they surveyed the aftermath of the high-stakes slaughter. But it had worked, for the Saxons at least. And the reticent, standoffish Cymric had got battle spoils and, more importantly to Hywel Dda, knowledge that the Mersons and West Saxons were in his debt. What would you have me say? Uhtred asked. I am sorry that I left you behind when you were 10 and I was 19 and I came to Bibbenberg to swear death to my uncle when I never even knew you existed. Finan said nothing. Battle had taken it out on all of them, and they were getting to be old men now. Look, she is coming over, Finan said, a few minutes later. It took a long time for him to tell Osrith the truth about where Uhtred had discovered he had a sister, for Osrith believed Ethelfled had told him. But that moment was not too far away, in the future, and everything would have changed for them. Osrith was carrying something, in her hand, Finan noticed, and his exceptional eyesight noticed, as she got nearer, that it was a silver coin. Osrith was turning it over and over to help her think. She had given it back to Finan, to break the implied symbol of a connection between them when she had left Dunham after following the outlaw Uhtred. But, he had slipped it into her hand before she left the cave at Bibbenberg that day, and Osrith had found it as she was riding back with Oswald's body. Would she give it back to him again? When she got close enough to stab Uhtred, Osrith stared at him. After all this time simply did not know what to say. But Uhtred did. Getting to his feet, he stood in front of her, and did not speak straight away. Instead, he stared at her for a few moments, shifting his weight from side to side. You're my sister? You're my brother, she returned disdainfully. one of them you have not gained Bibbenberg. Osrith's delight was palpable. No, he replied, then glared at Finan. You humped my sister? The Irishman looked abashed. What do you care? Osrith shot back. 'Tis a matter of honor, of blood. And the blood of the Scots is your altar. Osrith shouted back. You didn't think about blood when you came back to Bibbenberg. I was 10 years old. 10. Elfric had me all by on the road to Cjutan. By now, several people were turning as Osrith raged. But she had not pulled Buey. Not yet. I would be dead now had it not been for the king of the Picts. He gave me the chance to fight, and now I choose to use it to fight for my brother Wigger, Utad Bridald, to retain it. You may be the elder brother, but more nobles with vested interest choose. We are not yet a Frankish kingdom which follows primogeniture, nor Wessex, which seeks to follow. The best noble for the land is Wigger Elfricson. He is loyal to his people, he is a Christian. And you would turn him heathen? It was not a question. As much as Osrith knew about Utad, he knew something of her. And it was enough to stay her outrage. Jaitha, our mother, was a Varian, the ancient ruler of Usht. The Cymric were Christians far longer ago than the House of Idaho. Wigger has the better claim. But already Utad's hand was on serpent breath. However, Osrith had already withdrawn Buey. Then she turned, surveying the violated battlefield. I did what I agreed, Ethelfled of Mercia. Osrith screamed, to the heavens. But the voice came from beside her. Kneel to me. Her voice came from behind Osrith, and they glanced over her shoulder. Still battle-clad, Ethelfled held her sword aloft. Ha! Osrith scorned, and put away Buey. She would not fight the bitch, not give her the satisfaction of the event. You swore to Mercia. I am the Lady of Mercia, Ethelfled pointed out. You were not there when I knelt before your husband, and swore to Mercia its land, its earth, its rivers. You not the ruler to whom I swore. Poor Oldham witnessed. Did he not tell you one night? And she had her. Everyone saw Ethelfled take a quick movement to Osrith, which she quickly concealed. But it was too late. Osrith, meanwhile, stood unmoved, unarmed. You chose Ethelred, Ethelfled clarified. I chose Ethelred, yes, repeated Osrith. But I was too late. You can thank me later. You are as impertinent as your brother, Ethelfled accused. Clearly a quality you find appealing. Osrith spat back, then glanced back to Utad. Even if you are war-wise as a mouse's cock. Shouldn't the trash talk begin before the battle? Finan, ever quick to use black humor to quench hostilities, spoke for everyone watching. And, between us and the enemy? They had all used every bit of their strength for many hours holding the field, and the conflict between the two women was not needed. But that was the spectators' opinion. Between themselves, this conflict had been simmering for decades. Osrith ignored Finan, and she glanced at Utad, who was putting no effort into hiding his amusement. You were not at Bedford, or Chester, Ethelfled accused. Nor you at St. Andrews, Dunedin, Dunnottar, 3 times, Dunkeld, Stirling, Doyle, Armagh, Benfleet. Wise. Osrith paused, playing up thoughtfulness. Once, you were there. But not upright. Osrith then turned her back to Ethelfled and took a step towards Utad. Good to meet you, brother. I am sure Ethelfled was overwhelmed with excitement in telling you. She glanced at his leg. I trust you regain your strength. Wait. Called Utad, his face confused, potent questions filling his mouth. But Osrith was already stalking back through the war dead on the battlefield, over to the Mersins, who were greeting her as one of their own, as well they might. She had been one of their own, on and off, for the last 20 or so years. Feeling the silver piece in her hand, her thoughts were drawn to Finan for a moment, and Osrith dashed them away as she slipped the metal into her pocket. And, now to Alba, Osrith thought, as she trod the muddy, blood-stricken ground to the stores. Fires were already blazing, to heat water and treat the dead, to make food for injured and uninjured men. Mercia will give me food this night, and I am owed a horse, Osrith thought. Her heart wrenched when she thought again of old Helm being brought down. He had done so much to renew the spirit of the Mersons with St. Oswald. Ethelred, should he recover, would sore miss his adviser. And that was another situation, should he not? An hour later, and Osric had found the brown mare which had carried her from Bargany. Better a beast she knew than another, and she made sure it was fed and saddled before looking north. To leave now was the best thing, as the battle crossed that liminal frontier from ended into past, where clean-up and spoils collection became feasting and celebration. But there would be no feasting for the Mersons. Ethelred was critical, and would have to have divine intervention to recover. North took her towards Ethelflaed's own town of Stafford, where the road would continue beyond Mercia and into, nominally, Northumbria. Osric had taken the road before, but in reverse, when she had come down from Ibbenburg. Now, she would travel roughly the same route back, and considered whether she should go back to Wigger and congratulate him for holding the fortress. No need to decide now, Osric thought. Just get to Manchester, to where Osbert, Alfred's firstborn, now released from Uhtred's service, held a garrison. With Wigger's wife living with him, she added grimly. Not her fight, she added, as she looked at the first river that she was to cross, the Tame. And then she turned. It could have been so much different, Osric thought. She could have dashed. But her thoughts came to a halt when she caught King Edward's eye. His temples rose as his eyes recognized her, but then he went back to discussion with his advisers. Ethelhelm, Osric thought, grimly. His wife's father. She really disliked the man, and Osric wondered whether it was because he had taken Ottawa lands. He had been a true lord, a gentleman, honorable. By contrast, Ethelhelm was scheming and self-serving. Osric pulled at the reins of her horse as she turned her, but pulled up sharply when she saw a person running towards her. Finan. And beside him, her brother. The mare shook its head in a defiant way as it expressed its displeasure at being halted. "Where do you go?" Uhtred asked, when he finally got himself next to the horse. The leg injury would take some healing, Osric surmised. "North. Young Edru is there," she added. Uhtred stepped back, and she expected Finan, his shadow, to do so too. But instead he took her arm. "You kept the silver," he pointed out, and this time it was Osric's turn to slip from the saddle and delay the horse's pleasure to ride. She reached down and held his hand. Then drew it to her stomach. "Your child," she said, smiling. The look on his face was worth the telling. But then the father of Osric's child glared at her, as realization flooded his brain. "And you fought in a battle? And you will be fighting another," Osric reassured him. "Ethelred will not be long for this world, Elfred will be married off and there will be a fight for Mercia. The Lady of the Mersons will not step aside, and—" It was Finan shaking his head that stayed her tongue, and he pulled her close. "Thamir Modoi," he told her, his fingers tracing her hairline. "It can only be," she replied. "Pose me, Osric, Mojail?" he asked, taking the hand in which Osric held his silver piece. "I have only one home, Finan Moor," she told him. "Thagail Agamort. Thyra and Baka's daughter lives there. Dunnottar. When you come to fetch me, then I will marry you, Irishman. But you have to want me more than you want Uhtred." She stepped back, and reached for her horse's reins. Pain crossed his face. She didn't mean it, it was Uhtred she wanted to hurt, and Osric knew she was lashing out at the one person she loved the dearest in all the world. "You have a life here," she added, softening her blunt words. He pressed her hand to his chest as he moved his to her lower stomach, as if checking his memory that she had actually said what she had. And they parted, with no more words. When he felt his oath to Uhtred had been spent, Osric told herself, as the fields gave way to sandstone rocks on the road north, "That will be when he comes. It could be tomorrow, or never." "So that is your sister," Ethelflaed said, who had come to stand by her former lover. "You knew?" Uhtred replied, shocked. "How long?" "Perhaps 6 months." She smiled at him. "The question is, how could you not have guessed?" Uhtred looked across to Finan, who was watching Osric ride away, but got no back up there. She fights like you, behaves like you, Ethelfled continued. Not she wasn't raised by Danes. Utad narrowed his eyes. Raised by Picts, which is worse. Or Gales. Who can tell the difference? I can, Finan said, vaguely, watching Osrith go until she was a speck in the distance. When Ethelfled excused herself, and returned to a council, which had become an informal witan, Utad turned to his friend as a memory surfaced. I wronged her, he told his friend. At Aylesbury. I feel the same. She has just told me she is, well. She's riding away, Finan said, eyes still north. But he slapped his friend's shoulder to make him look at him. Finan, I wronged her, Utad said, his eyes burning into Finan's. You know I went to see Hild? She lay dying. She said it was her wish that Osrith and I were reunited. Utad laughed an ironic laugh. For all the gods, Finan. Because the realization was falling into place in Utad's mind. She hates you, for some reason, Finan said, obliquely. You know the reason? Finan shook his head in the evening sunlight. I don't. He insisted, when he saw Utad's face. So was told who it was who caused the death of Gisela. It wasn't a confession, as such, just Utad sharing his thoughts with the surroundings. Or, at least, that's what he told himself. He told me she was a witch. So I dealt with her. You what? Finan looked at his friend. Look, Utad, you gotta tell me that again. I don't think I heard you the first time. You heard me, Utad said, miserably. I found out she was there, Hild confirmed it. She gave Gisela herbs during the birth. And she did not deny it. Births are tricky, Finan said, holding Utad's gaze. Women take herbs, give herbs. God love them, they are not as strong as we are. Utad said nothing for a moment, just watched his friend's face. You know she sought herbs from the Britons? Finan said nothing. You know Osrith sought herbs from the Britons. It was not a question. Osrith had been unconscious when Finan had carried her there, bloody and close to death. She had used herbs then. Finan knew in his heart the child she had tried to eliminate had been Edward's, and he had begged, pleaded with Allah to keep her alive. And the British healer had. Now, she had assured him she was going to a place she thought of as safe, with the miracle that was his child, being carried by her, the woman he loved. She had kept his silver piece. Could he ride after her now, and tell her she was more important to him than her brother was? Because, it was true, it always had been. So I dealt with her. Utad had repeated his qualifying statement. You are just going to have to explain, Utad, Finan replied, shaking his head. It's been a long, tiring day, and so I gave her to Ethelwold to punish on my behalf. You did what? The usually loquacious Finan was lost for words. The day before we went to battle at Thundersley, before we faced Heston with Edward's promised troops. Before I found out the bastard was Ragnar's murderer. But Finan was still processing Utad's words. You listened to Ethelwold? Finan shook his head, and looked north again. Hold on just a minute. This was when Alfred was ill. She disappeared. Came back to Winchester, then disappeared again. He looked back to Utad, willing his friend to take back what he had just been telling him, saying it was untrue. For Finan had seen the state of her on the morning before she disappeared. I told him what I wanted done with her. But Finan had had enough, and took his friend's shoulders. You should have seen her, Utad. He shouted at his lord. Where her body was not black with bruises, it was red from welts and cuts with a blade. He tortured her. He beat her. Finan let Utad go, and looked away. I thought it was that shite Edward, he added, almost to himself. Then Finan fell silent, remembering a time long ago, in a different land, when he had wronged her, too. I told him to, I was angry. She provoked me into it. But then, Hild said that I had it false, she was there, with medicine, paid from her own money from the heathen healer to come, but she would not. For the nuns had done all they could for her. They saved my son. There never was much hope for Gisela. My God, Utad. And that was all Finan could manage, as he sank onto the damp ground, staring away into his own mind. Utad sat too. It was that, or be hanged, Utad said, quietly after a time. She allowed us all to call her a witch to shield the Britons. But Finan had a look on his face more terrible even when they were at their greatest despair, enslaved. I was there, Finan murmured, when she said it. What? More silence. Fire crackled. I just said it is funny how a light old in one place could soar ahead so quickly. And I suppose Ethelwold had spent a lot of time with the Danes. And there had been Danes and Norse in Erin. Utad was at a loss. But the day had been long, and he was in no mood to untangle his friend's riddles. If, indeed, Finan was his friend now he had confessed his role in Osrith's torture by Ethelwold. I promised I would help you get back Bibbenberg, Finan said, at last, and, believe me, I will help you get back Bibbenberg. Utad watched him shake his head. After that. And Finan trailed off to silence, and they both got drunk, and the matter was discussed no more.